Hi, welcome to the first ever online 2017 Tiny House Summit. I'm Sarah Isabella, and today we have a Community Day presentation with Sarah Murphy of Tiny House Hoteli, former owner and operator of Music City Tiny House, and she'll be presenting today with Airbnb Your Tiny House. Take it away, Sarah.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I am so excited to be doing this. I have been the Nashville kind of premier contact for tiny houses since early 2014. We commissioned our tiny house, Music City Tiny House, from Tennessee Tiny Homes in about January, February of 2014. It was delivered in June of 2014, and almost immediately we were hosting open houses and tiny house hopefuls as overnight guests. We became the state chapter leaders for the American Tiny House Association right around that same time. And we've been kind of just riding the wave of the tiny house movement ever since, public speaking and trying to gain support and momentum for the tiny house movement here in Nashville towards legalization. We started off as the hosts of Tiny House for Music City Tiny House, and then we ended up selling it not too long ago to fund another venture. And at the same time, I formed the new site, which is Tiny House Hoteli, which, for those who don't know, a hoteli is kind of a term of endearment for people who attended the Cornell Hotel School. I did my master's program there. I've been in hospitality my whole career. And so it was a really natural fit for us when we decided to join the tiny house movement to kind of make it a hospitable one. And after 2.5 years of hosting guests in Music City Tiny House, we really, my husband and I both, but mainly myself, really felt like we should be sharing a lot of that knowledge that we learned. More and more people are turning their tiny houses into Airbnbs as an investment, as a way to maybe build now and live in it later, but get it paid off in the meantime. And as a way to kind of take advantage of this share culture, the Airbnb culture that we have. Not everybody wants people in their homes, but maybe they're eager to host guests and share what they have. And so that's kind of why I got into the consulting side, the knowledge share side of hosting tiny houses. And I have just learned so much over the past 3 years of hosting tiny houses. And I just really would hate for that to end with me. And so that's kind of where this came from. So I'm going to start off with, you're going to have to bear with me because I hate PowerPoint, and I think probably most people do, but I've created one for you guys so that you don't have to stare at my face the whole time while I'm talking. But I'm going to toggle back and forth because sometimes there's just no point in just staring at a bland PowerPoint presentation. So I'm going to connect over here. I'm going to press play, and boom, here we go. I'm not sharing my screen, am I? I told you guys, this is not. Let's see here. Share. There we go. Now I'm screen sharing. And play. Okay, great. So here we are. Airbnb Your Tiny House. What you should know and do before hosting your first guest. I focused on what you should know and do before hosting your first guest for a reason. I think there's a lot of information out there as to how to host once you've decided to be a host and you're kind of in it. But a lot of the questions that I get from people that reach out are actually what to do before you even get to that stage. So we're going to work through that a little bit here. And if they're at the end of the presentation, if you still have a list of burning questions, you can certainly hop on my website, which is tinyhousehoteli.com, and send me a note, a message, and be happy to talk about anything that I've missed. So that's me, the Hoteli. This was our tiny house, Music City Tiny House. I designed it to build to be built around our lifestyle. And so one of the flagship, I guess, parts of our tiny house was our kitchen. We were the first, I believe. It was before there was a ton of tiny houses on Pinterest yet, but we have that giant farmhouse sink that I think is in a lot of tiny houses now. And that was the one concession that I wouldn't make if we were going to be or live in a tiny house, which we never ended up doing, which is probably a story that you've heard me tell elsewhere. And if not, it's time for another day. But I would live in a tiny house, but I would not sacrifice the size of my sink. And so we ended up with this giant farmhouse sink. So here's the agenda today. The number one question that I get asked time and time again is it legal? And so we're going to touch base on that a little bit. I'm going to try and keep it brief because there's a ton of information that I've already put out there on the web, whether it's on our website, Music City Tiny House, or Tiny House Hotelli. And so I'm going to briefly go over kind of what the basics are that you should be asking yourself. But for the most part, we're not going to spend a ton of time on that. So is it legal? Do you care? And I put that there because tiny houses in many cases fit somewhere in the gray area. And it really depends on how much risk you're willing to take as to whether or not you care if it's legal or not in your immediate vicinity and in your jurisdiction. So we'll talk about that a little bit and what some of the risks are if you decide to maybe take a risk. How much risk you're taking based on some factors. We'll talk about that a little bit. How to determine if and what is legal, how to determine what your risks options are if it's not. And then we'll move on to running your tiny house like a business, which I think is probably the most important thing. We're going to go over some of the basics: insurance, cost control, setting your price, forming as a business. And the last thing is kind of a little bit of fun thing because talking about, is it legal and the basics of running a business are a little dry. And so I just threw this in at the end because it's something that you might not think about, or maybe you would think about, but maybe you'd be surprised at some of the answers that we got most requests for. So threw that in at the end for a little fun. Let's start off with, is it legal? In order to answer this question, it's not a one size fits all, unfortunately. I wish it was. And so it really is almost a case by case basis, but what I can do is I can kind of work you through some mental exercises to determine whether or not it's legal or not. The first one would be, is it on wheels or off wheels? So if you have a house that's on wheels, your set of rules is going to be completely different than if it's off wheels. And what do I mean by that? So if a tiny house is on wheels, in most cases, the two things that you need to look at are, is it legal based on zoning regulations, and is it legal based on building code regulations? And so if it's on wheels, you no longer have to worry about the building code regulations, because if it's on wheels, it's regulated by the DMV or the MVA, depending on which jurisdiction you live in, which is why they started being built on wheels in the first place, because it bypassed all the building codes, which restricted square footage and had all these other rules and regulations. So they were built on wheels to bypass all of that. So if it's on wheels, you don't need to worry about complying with the building regulations, but you do need to worry about complying with zoning regulations. And so that's kind of where people get hung up. Tiny houses on wheels, in most cases, are not legal sort of regulation against RVs, mobile homes, anything that would be prohibitive of things on wheels. If it's off wheels and it's on a foundation, and perhaps you live in the middle of a city and you say, I have a giant backyard, I'd love to put a tiny house in the back, maybe a granny flat, or the official term in most places is either ADU or DADU. With ADU stands for accessory dwelling unit, and DADU stands for detached accessory dwelling unit, or on foundation. And if they're on a foundation, then they need to comply with both zoning and building codes. So is it legal? I would start with your particular plot of land, which may be zoned completely different than the plot of land next to yours, and see what's permittable and permissible on your plot of land within your zone. Now, I live in Nashville. Nashville makes it really easy to check that. You can go onto the web page for the city. They let you kind of search for your address. You can find out what your zone is, and then unfortunately, the next step is pretty straightforward, but takes a lot of work. You actually have to then go into the zoning document and look for your particular zoning code and then all the things that are permitted. Now, here's something that's important to remember. PowerPoint, something would pop up here and dance around a little bit. But in most zoning, and I've read probably more than I would like to admit, if it is not, we get used to the thought of, well, if it doesn't say we can't, then we can, right? Like the Constitution basically says that, if it's not strictly said that you are allowed or not allowed to do it within this document, then you can. Well, within most zoning codes, there's actually a fine print somewhere that says if it's not expressly in this document that you can do it, you should assume that you cannot. And so that's kind of where most people lose the battle in trying to, find that gray area when it comes to the zoning codes. So if you're on foundation and your zone permits a DADU or an ADU, then you are likely fine to go and apply for permits through the building codes. So you really just need to make sure that you comply with both building and zoning. Probably bored 90% of you already with this, and I'm not even through my first bullet point. So all of this is to say that there really is no one answer for everybody, and everybody that asks me this, they'll say, hey, like I live in like East Nashville, are they legal over there? And it really is a much more complicated answer than that. So when determining whether or not your tiny house is legal where you are, you need to make sure that you check with your zoning and your building code regulations if it's on foundation. If it's not on a foundation, it's on wheels, you only really need to find out whether or not it complies with your zoning. Now, that's also a gray area because you may have to check with building for things like utilities. So if you wanted to get electricity installed, or if you wanted to get utilities such as water, brought to your site, you would probably have to work with building to get those permits and stuff. So no straight answer here, unfortunately. But we can continue to get more complicated because I know you guys were worried about that. So the third bullet point, we're going to do that. We're going to talk about specific Airbnb regulations in your area. Not everybody has these yet. More and more cities are going to have Airbnb regulations soon, without a doubt. And there are a number of reasons why they're starting to regulate Airbnb. And it's not all just because they want the revenue from it, although most cities are definitely looking to get revenue from Airbnb. There are also a lot of affordable housing concerns. And I think the tiny houses need to really kind of take the forefront of this fight in some way. And here's why: because as tiny housers, there's a large portion of the movement is concerned about affordability of housing. And so what we're seeing in a lot of cities that are impacted heavily with Airbnb are companies or individuals that are buying up large amounts of inventory that would otherwise go towards people who live and reside in those communities, and are Airbnb-ing them full time. And so, the teachers, the police officers, the municipal workers that might have been able to afford living in that neighborhood once upon a time are no longer, because they're being inventory is being taken off the market and Airbnb'd to the tourists in the area, which thus hikes up the rent for the available housing in that area. And I think that is one of the things that as tiny housers we need to be, we are just inherently, I feel like, are sensitive to the affordability of housing, because a lot of that is one of the things that draws a lot of people to the tiny house movement is the affordability of housing. So we are seeing a lot of Airbnb regulations enacted, and if you're going to choose to Airbnb your tiny house, they may apply to you. And so it's worth looking into that and seeing what regulations there are and if it applies to tiny houses. So that's just something to look into. Let's get even yet more complicated. Is the plot of land that you have and that you're putting your tiny house on zoned for business use? So let's just go through here. Let's say you live in a city where tiny houses on wheels are legal. Fresno, California recently permitted tiny houses as long as they're secondary to a primary dwelling. So much like granny flats or dadus or ADUs. So let's say tiny house on wheels are permitted. Check. They pass both building and zoning code. Check. There's no necessary Airbnb regulations that you need to worry about, meaning you looked into it, and if they did, regulate tiny houses, you complied with all of those. Check. Is your plot of land zoned for business use? Yikes. This may become an issue at some point. So many people, when you buy your house or you buy your land, there's paperwork that you sign during the closing that makes you agree to the fact that you're not using it for business purposes. Not everybody. It's worth looking at your lease or your mortgage paperwork to see if this is the case. Now, like a lot of things in tiny houses, there's some gray area here, because how are they going to know? Will they even care? Maybe not. It's just worth knowing whether or not this is an area of risk for you. One of the things that we're seeing in areas that are cracking down on Airbnb use, when they are losing arguments in other areas, they then, as last resort, the cities will turn to the owners and say, well, you're running a business, which is essentially a business, on your home, which is zoned residential. Therefore, you're not in compliance and you cannot continue to run your business unless you rezone your property, which, if you rezone your property for business use, may mean that you have to then go and get your mortgage adjusted to allow for business use. This is just something to keep in mind. I've never, ever heard of anybody be shut down for this, but it is something to keep in mind, and something we may see more cities and jurisdictions point to as a reason to not allow Airbnb. Tiny houses really don't need another excuse as to why not to be allowed to Airbnb. And finally, what permits are needed and do you qualify? So this is so in some areas, you may need a permit, such as an occupancy permit. If you are allowed to have your tiny house, you may also need to have an occupancy permit. If there are Airbnb regulations, they may require you to have an Airbnb permit or a short-term vacation rental permit. You might need a sales and use tax collection permit, all of those things. So just make sure that you're looking into all the things that you would need to have in order to run your tiny house, and then verifying that you qualify. If you are still on board and interested in Airbnb your tiny house, we are going to continue on. And the next step here is, do you care? Do you care about all of this stuff, these hoops that you have to jump in to be considered quote unquote legal? What are the risks? So a couple of the risks that we'll talk about. One, poor Airbnb ratings, which could affect your future listings. So let's say you say, I don't care about any of that. I don't know if I comply, if I have permits, if I need them, I don't know. But what I do know is that lots of people are Airbnb their tiny houses in my area, and they're not having a problem with it, and they're making hand over fist money. So I'm just going to throw mine up on Airbnb, and I'm just going to hope for the best. And then you're renting and you've got your place booked out, and 2 weeks into it, you've got a note tacked to the door or a letter in the mail that says you need to shut down immediately. And unfortunately, what that means is you need to cancel everybody that's booked and that could lead to really poor Airbnb ratings. Let's say you decide to move it to a new location where they haven't found you yet. And so you don't cancel any reservations, you just move it. But then the guests who booked with you now are at a new location, and maybe it's not as good, or maybe it's a little bit better, but it's different than what they expected. They're not going to rate you as highly as they otherwise would have. So perhaps not even the biggest risk, but one risk to keep in mind, that guests on Airbnb really like to have no surprises, and they want it to be a low maintenance encounter. So, they could otherwise be choosing a hotel where they know what the rate is, they know what the experience is going to be like, they kind of know what the room's going to be, are very similar, and they know that everything is going to go smoothly for the most part. It's always a little bit of a risk with an Airbnb anyways, but then if you add things like changing location, or I have to close, it really doesn't bode well. So that's probably the most minor of the risks, but I figured I'd throw it in there. The next one is fines. In Nashville, if you are in violation of a zoning code and you continue to operate, it's $50 a day to continue to operate. Risk, and maybe you're saying, well, hell, I'm making $150 a night, so I'll just factor in $50. That's your prerogative, I guess. But the next one is a little bit more serious, and that's the seizing of property. Some places, I know someone here in Nashville that was sued by the city for not removing their tiny house from where they had it after they had been warned and fined. So just be careful of where you are, and knowing what the limitations and what the abilities of your local government are. And so, fine, seizing of property, and strained relationship with your neighbors shouldn't be underestimated, especially if you own your place. A lot of people that I talk to that are successful as Airbnbers, they start off before they even have their tiny house, going around to all their neighbors and saying like, hey, this is what my plans are. How do you feel about that? Do you have any concerns? I'd love to mitigate those. Like, let's talk about this. And just being neighbors, right? When we put our tiny house in our backyard, we invited everybody over, but they thought it was a shed. And they're like, why do you have an air conditioner in your shed? And we're like, come take a look at what we're doing. You'll love it. This is, what we're doing. And we got some really good responses. Is legal action. I mentioned it before from the city that took legal action, but it doesn't stop there. If your neighbors get mad enough, they can take legal action for any number of reasons. I mean, there's a lot of risks that you take when you go the tiny house route. If you have a composting toilet, many times composting toilets are illegal in a lot of jurisdictions. Unfortunately, the risks are just unquantifiable, and yet people take them all the same. So I'm not saying one way or the other. I mean, I've always been of the mind that when it comes to the tiny house movement, our personal goal was to further the tiny house movement, and we weren't going to get it very far if we continued to just ask permission for things. So we kind of went with the ask forgiveness rather than ask permission, and we rode that wave as long as we could, in the hopes that we would gain as much momentum for the tiny house movement as possible. And it worked out pretty well for us. So I'm not telling you to go out and do it, but I am saying, weigh your risks and then decide, what decision you want to make from there. So the next one here is your options as to whether or not you decide to take the risk or not. And this depends. It varies case by case. If you decide to take the risk and you want to know, all the pros and cons, it really depends case by case. And so I can certainly help people work through those things if I know all the details about your situation and what the likelihood is of, being shut down based on, how many people are already doing it in your area, how savvy the local government is. Here in Nashville, 2 tiny houses were shut down. Tiny house Airbnbs were shut down over the course of 2 weeks. And it wasn't because somebody was out there driving around the streets looking for Airbnbs or tiny houses. They were just merely going on Airbnb and some of the reporting tools that they have, other people have pulled out from their API on sites. And they were just going down the list and seeing, you know, oh, this is a camper, this is an Airstream, this is a tiny house, this is a boat, right? And so the jurisdictions are getting pretty smart if they're looking to crack down. So I can help you work through those risks if you'd like. 2, running your tiny house like a business. I'm very passionate about this because I think that if you're going to rent out your tiny house for any reason, whether it's just because you want to make new friends that, you know, love tiny houses, or, you know, if you're actually looking to make an investment in this business and maybe you want to open up a tiny house hotel or whatever, make sure that you've got the business mindset going into it. Because we'll go into a little bit of some of the perks about it as we go. So we're going to start off with forming as an LLC. Why? Because it's best practice. You know, it's recommended, not required. I didn't. In hindsight, that was silly. I just got a little bit lazy and just kind of went with it. We started, it just was kind of a whirlwind for us. And before we knew it, we were up and running. And I never actually filled out the paperwork. But there's a number of reasons why we recommend doing it as an LLC. LLCs as a form of business are super easy to maintain. Some people, you know, would prefer to do corporations or any other number of ways, but require a board. It doesn't require, you know, regular filing of any paperwork, such as like minutes, that type of thing. So LLCs are simple to maintain and they protect you from liability. That's probably the main one that people will tell you. Why an LLC? Because if you have an LLC and you're running your tiny house as an LLC, your personal assets are protected from any liability. Why is that important? Because bad things happen. And if, you know, somebody was in your loft and they were to have fallen out and badly injured themselves, you and your family in your house and all the things that were not directly related to your LLC, the tiny house business, would be safe from lawsuit. Now, if you decide to do it as an LLC, my number one recommendation is to file in Delaware. You know, obviously talk to a professional, but that's best practice. And one of the main reasons why is that Delaware has a really smart and savvy set of laws around LLCs. They're business friendly. Most LLCs in the country are formed in Delaware because they just have a really good and efficient set of laws. You can go online and do all of your tax payments. They just make it really simple to form as an LLC. And it's fairly inexpensive. I think the minimum payment based on how much you're making is like $300 a year or something. And the last reason that LLCs are great is that they allow for tax flexibility. And so you can actually be taxed as a pass-through entity, much like you would a sole proprietorship, or you could, you know, be taxed as a company or corporation. So that's my recommendation there. Form as an LLC. If you don't form as an LLC, at least form as a business, because in many places they'll require you to form as a business if you're collecting revenue. I know in Nashville, that's my current point of reference, anything over $3,000 in sales is required to have a license, a business license. Anything over $10,000 in sales is required to pay, you know, business taxes and, you know, file for sales and use tax and all of that. So, you know, filing as a business is probably required if you're doing any sort of decent revenue. And so my recommendation is do it as an LLC, just because you get all that added protection. But if you're not going to, at least do it as a business. There's some cost-saving benefits of forming as a business, and the majority of that lies in anything that you buy and use for the business is then tax deductible. That alone should be worth forming as a business and not just running it as, you know, an individual person running a tiny house. And that, I mean, all the sheets, the towels, the toilet paper, everything that you buy would be tax deductible. That's huge. So that's my recommendation there. Insurance. Insurance is one of those things that people are like, well, I have insurance, or Airbnb offers insurance. And so I'm not going to tell you whether to buy it or not buy it, but everybody that I have this conversation with goes and does their own homework, and they end up buying their own insurance. And so I've gone over a few of the reasons why I think it's important for people to do that here. One, don't assume that Airbnb or VRBO has sufficient coverage. I know they offer insurance. I know that they do. But they also they're incentivized not to pay out for a number of reasons. With Airbnb, I know, for example, they're gonna ask if you've tried to mitigate the situation first. They're gonna put a little bit of that onus on you. They're also probably only gonna cover it if it happened while they were officially checked in. So let's say you have a 2 p.m. check-in time, and they asked if they could come at 1 o'clock, and you're like, sure, why not? And so they roll in at 1 o'clock and they proceed to fall out of your loft. If it's outside of those official check-in times, you may or may not be covered. May or may not cover if something were to happen. They may not cover the lost income. So if, for example, a tornado came and took your tiny house, and you were out of a tiny house, but you had $10,000 worth of reservations on the books, other insurance will make sure that you have coverage and reimbursement protection for that lost revenue. They also may or may not cover things like loss, people using your fire pit, or usage of bikes that you may have on the property and that you let guests use. Any of those things are worth looking into. So make sure that you talk to your current insurance provider if you have one. Homeowners insurance is likely not going to cover you. Homeowners insurance generally covers maybe the first night stay or the first reservation that you have. But if they find out you've been paid for it, you'll likely need a business rider in order for it to cover that. And so in my experience, going through whoever you have your homeowner's insurance, but adding the business rider and then adding the income protection and adding all of that tends to be really, really expensive. And so what I use and what I recommend to everybody, because this is their niche, is CBiz. And that's C as in cat, B-I-Z. Their whole thing is short-term vacation rentals. They cover tree houses, tiny houses, boats, you name it. Alternative dwellings are like their niche, and they're super easy to work with, and they're great. So that's who I recommend. I don't get any points or anything for recommending them to you, other than I think that they will give you a really great experience, and that's worth something. And so the last two things in this section are cost control and setting price. And so we'll talk about cost control. This is really important, because I think it's easy for people just to run the tiny house like they would their house. And so not everybody, especially if you're in the tiny house mindset, you're not really thinking about buying bulk, right? Because you're like trying to, go tiny, or you think that, that there isn't enough space for all of these things. And so my suggestion here is to identify your consumables. And I have some stuff on tinyhousehotelly.com about identifying the consumables, and I've identified consumables that you really need to buy in quantity. An example of a few of these things: toilet paper. You're going to go through a lot of it. It actually has blown my mind how much toilet paper some people make or use. And I think that a little bit of that with the tiny houses is because it's alternative toilet options. And so they're like, I think I need a ton of toilet paper in here to make sure it doesn't smell, or, that, nobody can see what I've done in here. So toilet paper, buy in bulk. You will not regret it. Paper towels, obviously, another thing to buy in bulk. Cleaners. I'm a big one for all natural cleaners. And so I like there's a cleaner out there called Branch Basics, and it comes in a concentrate, and you basically just buy the concentrate, and then you dissolve it with, or you mix it with regular water or filtered water, but it comes in bulk, and it makes it more cost effective. And so I recommend buying anything you can in quantity. The next thing here is establish a clean, dry, and secure storage area. Probably not in your tiny house. There might be enough room in your tiny house for a few things, but we ended up using part of our garage for the storage of all of our stuff. Necessarily want to keep it where it's not secure. People are amazing. And I had very few negative stories about hosting the over 500 guests that we hosted while doing our Airbnb. But people take weird things. And I can't explain it. I've heard stories about people losing silverware. You know, I worked in restaurants for over a decade, and sure enough, there's a large portion of people out there that take silverware. I don't know. You'd start with 4 forks. You'd come back and you'd only be clearing 3. I don't know why, but establish a clean and dry and secure storage area for all of those extra bulk items, because they may think, well, they got plenty of them here. They certainly don't need all of them. And so extra sheets, extra towels, extra washcloths, all of that stuff, store that somewhere where you could lock it up. Another recommendation or pro tip here is to pick a color scheme and a brand persona. For us, we picked beige, white, orange, and a blue. And so we had 4 colors that gave us a little bit of flexibility, wherein if we were walking through a store and we saw some towels on sale that happened to match one of those colors, we'd grab them. But then we also weren't tied into like just white sheets. White sheets are actually a really bad idea. For some reason, we found an immense amount of luck with beige sheets, and it wasn't that the white sheets would necessarily get stains on them, because the bleach would take them out. We found that they would wash and then turn different colors. So if we did all of our whites over the course of a couple months, we'd find that they started looking like different shades of white. Now, maybe that doesn't bother everybody, but that just drove me crazy. So we had a bunch of luck with beige. And then when it came to towels, we found that any other color but white was actually a real challenge. People would have face wash that would bleach any other color other than white. And then, they'd be taking off their makeup and stuff. And unless you could really just bleach it, it wouldn't come out. So my recommendation is pick a color scheme. Don't get everything in one color. Let yourself be flexible, because you're going to find sales on different things. But I do recommend sheets in colors other than white and white towels. Those are my recommendations there. I also recommend buying industrial or commercial grade items when possible. So things are going to get a lot of use, and while things in your house are going to get a lot of use too, I found that for some reason, things get more use when you're renting them out to strangers than they do in your own home. So if you have anything that, anything even down to like your key box, right? If you get like a small key box that's made for like residential use, you're probably going to buy 2 or 3 of them before the end of the year. If you get a good quality industrial key box, like that thing is going to be good forever. So if you have the option between buying the, chintzy handheld vacuum or the actual industrial quality vacuum, like go the industrial route. It'll save money in the hind end. And then lastly, find your personal balance of price and quality. And this is important, I think, to tie into your brand persona. If your brand persona is going to be like an eco-friendly, zero toxin persona, that's kind of going to answer your balance of quality and price for you, right? Like if you're going to go out of your way to make sure that there are no environmental items or no items that would trigger environmental sensitivity, and that you wash all of the sheets in like detergents for sensitive skin, and all of your cleansers are environmentally friendly, and that maybe you only use bamboo sheets, all of those things, you're going to have a bit more of a cost burden, and so your rates are going to be a little bit higher. So you can justify that by saying, like, we're not just a tiny house, like our persona is this niche. Otherwise, like if you're just kind of, for us, when we started, we were really looking to be as affordable as possible. Like, we wanted to get people through our tiny house because we wanted people to fall in love with the movement and turn around and build their own. And so we tried to keep our price low, despite the fact we were in a downtown area of Nashville with, our neighbors were selling out their place for like double the rates that we were our tiny house. And so we had to find that balance of price and quality. And so instead of the super fluffy Charmin toilet paper, we used the Kirkland's brand, which, by the way, is actually pretty good. But we were able to, figure out what we liked and then kind of get the rhythm of buying that. For example, Kohl's has some really great towels. And so on Black Friday every year, we'd go and we'd snatch up a bunch of their towels because they were a good quality and they were a really good price when we could get them. So that's my recommendation there, is to figure out what your personal balance of price and quality are, so that you know what to keep an eye out for. And then the last thing is probably the most important when it comes to pricing and how much money you're going to make, and that's setting your price. The Airbnb didn't have this when we first started hosting, but they did come out with it a little bit, maybe a year and a half after we started hosting, and that's the auto pricing. And so you can absolutely just set up your Airbnb profile and turn on your auto pricing and then move on. But I do not recommend that right off the bat. I think that what's important to recognize is that tiny houses are not like the condos, the full houses, and the things that everybody else on your street may be renting. And that's what they're using in that algorithm, is what is the most amount, what are the properties in your immediate vicinity renting for? And then, like, based on that and what your amenities are, like doing some sort of, gymnastics with the numbers to figure out what your price should be. I think you should be very intimately involved with the pricing of your tiny house for at least the first couple of months, perhaps the first year, if you want to go through a full cycle or season. I recommend starting low to gain exposure. You can always raise your prices down the line. But if you keep them high, you're going to have a hard time getting heads in beds, and you're going to have a hard time getting those positive reviews. And Airbnb loves those positive reviews. And if you can get, the more people you host and the more positive reviews you get, the more likely you are to become a super host, the higher you'll get in their algorithms when people are searching. So we started off with a rate of like $89 a night. I think we even at some points went down to like $79 a night. I put together a spreadsheet. It's available on Tiny House Hoteli, and it can actually work through a lot of these mathematical formulas for you on, what pricing in high, medium, low season, what your profit margins would be. What's really important is to figure out kind of what your break-even point is. And so, like, if you break even right around $50 a night, if you're renting it out for $65 a night, then you're only making $15 on it, but it's $15 more than if you didn't rent it out at all. And so I think that's a really important thing to think about, is that where is that break-even point, and where is maybe the pardon my French, the pain in the ass factor. So if you're breaking even at 50, but you really don't want to take anything less than $75 because it's not worth you going out there and turning the thing over the next day, then make it 75 on those nights you're having a hard time booking, or that you're really having a hard time getting, heads in beds. Just put that as your minimum of $75. And then even if it's not making you a ton of money, it's getting you head in bed. It's going to be giving you the opportunity to create a positive review at the end of that. You don't have to do that forever, but just to get yourself some momentum on the Airbnb platform. It's important to recognize that Airbnb gives new properties a little bit of an edge, but they don't do it for long. So you really want to make sure that as soon as you're turning that listing on, you're ready to take reservations, and that you're getting reservations quick. Because if you're not, Airbnb will stop prioritizing your property, and it'll prioritize the ones that they know are going to get people to book. Start gaining that exposure. But then utilize upcharges and other pricing levers to disincentivize less than ideal guests. And what that means is that, maybe it's $75, your minimum is $75, but that's for one guest. or 2 guests, right? And then if they're a party of 4, there's an additional charge of $15 or $25 per person. So if, they're a party for 4, it was, $75, and now it's $125 because it's a party of 4. Now, there's an additional, in many cases, more people mean more consumables are being used, more chances of something going wrong. You get, this is one thing. Here's something that you'll see a lot of if you start to host. Somebody who's making the reservation talks the other 3 people in the party of 4 to stay into a tiny house because they personally are obsessed with tiny houses. They're so excited to stay in this tiny house that people are like, fine, let's do it. Whatever. It'll be great. It'll be fun. It's an adventure. And then they all get in the tiny house. And then that one person is so elated. They're so excited to be staying in the tiny house. But that person's mom is like, what is this? Like, this is not fun for me. I'm not happy here. And then you get all sorts of, knocks on your door or texts to your phone because, like, my mom doesn't, like the fact that there's so much light pouring in the windows. Do you have a blanket we can put over the window, etc.? So by utilizing upcharges, what you'll find is that you can really control the type of people that you want to attract. If you make it really inexpensive for those parties of 2 that you really hope that you're getting, you'll get more of them. So the other benefit to that is that you'll show up, your primary rate will show up as the lower rate. So if people are searching on Airbnb for like a tiny house in Scottsdale, Arizona, then Airbnb will show maybe that $75 rate on that Google search page, even though once they do all the math with the cleaning fee and the party of 4, it may be more like $150 a night. But they might not have even clicked on your page if it hadn't come up as $75. And so that click on your page is going to help elevate you in the Airbnb regulation or algorithm. So all these are like little tricks, and not to be deceptive. That's not the point here, but it's really just trying to mold behavior around what it is you're looking for. I can tell you that 4 people in a tiny house, which was the max that we allowed, is a lot of people in a tiny house. Even if you have 2 queen beds like we did, it's just a lot of people. And so we tended to make it more attractive in pricing for parties of 2 than we did for parties of 4. And that really helped us to kind of see a lot more of the parties of 2, which we felt were more appropriate for our space. The last thing here I'm going to go over, appreciated amenities and design aspects for guests. And this was, again, just a lighthearted little thing I'm throwing in here, kind of helping you to design out your space so that people that are staying with you get the most out of your space. Mirrors. We had 1 mirror in our tiny house because it was a tiny house and we assumed that 1 mirror would be plenty. But you'd be surprised how many people asked for additional mirrors. Maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but not a whole lot of tiny houses I've seen on Pinterest or otherwise have a ton of mirrors around. Some of them may be decorative, small, but this is for parties that were thinking, well, we have 1 person getting ready in the bathroom, but I wanted to do my makeup in the living room or something. And so you can solve that in any number of ways. I think we ultimately ended up hanging one on the outside of the sliding door to the bathroom. I've seen, the inside of kitchen cabinets with additional mirrors. You could stick something on the fridge. You name it, you can probably get another mirror in there. But just, guests oftentimes appreciate more than 1 mirror. Iron and ironing board. For us, we ended up doing an ironing pad that you can get for not too expensive. And then we suggested people use the stove top, turned off, obviously, to put that on there so they could iron their clothes. And then we got just a really small handheld iron. The other thing we got asked a lot for, are hooks and towels and hooks for towels and coats. So we had a couple hooks, and then we were, over the course of our time with the tiny house, we ended up installing many more hooks. People like hooks everywhere. So the more hooks you can get in there, the better. Kind of piggybacking on that is a place to hang clothes and store luggage. For us, when we first got it and we started hosting guests, we're like, well, you're only here for 2 days. Why do you need to hang clothes? We have an iron if it gets wrinkled. But people love hanging their clothes. That's kind of what they do at home. And while I recognize that maybe their reasonings for staying in a tiny house or to see if they could go tiny, and that would probably require some changes in behavior. Not everybody is all that amenable to changing their behavior right off the bat. So if you have a place to put a hanging rod where people can hang their clothes, they would most likely appreciate that. And then the place to store the luggage. We ended up never giving them a designated place to store luggage because we just didn't have any place. But it's one of those things where people had mentioned over and over again, it'd be really great if we had a place to store our luggage inside the tiny house. So if you have a corner or something that you can do to set aside for that, people love that. Hair dryer. The only thing I would mention with this is that to make sure that you get one that is appropriate for your electric usage. So if you're on, a 30 amp, or you are on solar or anything like that, hair dryers can pull a ton of energy. So just be cognizant of that when you go and buy a hair dryer for your Airbnb, that it's not something that's going to short out the entire tiny house when they turn it on the first time. We permitted pets in our house, in our tiny house. We don't regret it for a minute. And so those people that did bring their pets were appreciative of the fact that we provided pet dishes and dog waste bags, etc. So I always put that in there as a recommendation for anyone who's going to host pets. Washcloths, I thought went out of style with my grandparents, but apparently not. Guests want washcloths, so make sure you have those available. Window coverings. I know this sounds silly. Maybe you had already thought about this, but when we built our tiny house, we stuck an immense amount of, anywhere there was wall space, we put a window. And we did that because we figured if it's a small space, that the large windows would allow for a little bit of continuity between the inside and outside, make the space feel a little bit smaller. It also brings in a ton of natural light. So when we started hosting our tiny house, we put window coverings over all of the windows wherein privacy would be an issue. But we left window coverings off all of the windows wherein privacy wouldn't be an issue. Like nobody was going to be looking into those windows because they weren't really in a place where people could look into the windows. But time and time again, we got feedback that people wanted all the windows covered. And so if you have windows, make sure that they're covered. We ended up going with some frosted applications for some of the windows that we felt like the shower, for example, where not everybody puts a window in the shower, but we did. And so instead of putting, a curtain in there, we frosted the window there, and it was removable. So if anyone decided to ever change that could be changed. And then the last thing here are two minor things that we provided over time and that people were appreciative of and mentioned over and over again that they thought it was a great amenity. It was a lighter and wine glasses. Now we were a non-smoking tiny house, but we had a fire pit, and so we left a lighter in the tiny house. And I think people appreciated it for various reasons, whether they wanted to light candles or incense. Some people don't permit those things. We didn't mind them. And so we had a lighter and we had wine glasses. And if people went through all of the glasses, then they could use the wine glasses, or they could use the wine glasses for actual wine, which we also encouraged at our tiny house. So those are just some of the amenities and design aspects for guests that I'd recommend. I left a couple of things off that I always recommend. One of which is railings. These are like common sense things, so I didn't want to put them on here. But railings, if you have stairs, they tend to be steep in tiny houses. So make sure that you have something for people to grab onto. Also, if you have a loft, I recommend putting some banisters or railings so that people don't roll out. People will consume alcoholic beverages, whether you want them to or not. They may even have small children in there. And so I always recommend just to cover your own liability, those types of things. And finally, we're on the last slide, and that is if you want more info or tools, you can reach me here at Tiny House Hotelli or at sarah@tinyhousehotelli.com. And that's really it. I'm going to stop sharing here, and I'm going to move back here and see if you can see me here. So thank you so much. I know that some of this is really dry, and that's probably the downside of talking about the business side of Airbnb. But hopefully there was a ton of information there that was of value to you guys, and that will help you kind of get to that point of hosting guests in your own tiny house a bit smoother with a little bit less ambiguity. That's the goal here. So I hope you have a wonderful time.